The PS5 and the Xbox Series consoles are going to be 4 years old in just a couple of months. It's interesting to think that we are actually approaching the halfway point, seemingly, of this generation. And to a lot of people, it probably feels like this generation is just getting started. Now, that's a conversation for another time. What I want to do today is go over a very interesting report that comes from Digital Foundry, where they actually reached out to multiple high profile AAA game developers, simply asking the question, why is it that the less powerful PlayStation 5 console is in many instances outperforming the more powerful Xbox Series X? Obviously, this was the big question at the launch of these consoles, and that question persisted throughout months and years. But at the same time, people weren't necessarily expecting to get concrete answers because, well, developers were just getting started making games for these consoles. But now that we're basically halfway through the gen, I find it interesting that Digital Foundry is kind of following up here and trying to settle this once and for all and kind of close the case, if you will, on this specific topic. So if we look back at 2020, which is a year I think a lot of people don't want to look back on for understandable reasons, but that was the year that Sony launched the PS5 and Microsoft launched the Xbox Series X and S. And if you were following the build up to that launch, both Sony and Microsoft were going toe to toe, giving everything they had to get people as excited as they possibly could for these next generation consoles. And it was a good time, honestly. I miss seeing how intense that competition was, how fierce that competition was between Sony and Microsoft. Not to say that it doesn't exist at all at this point, but it's definitely simmered down quite a bit, I think it's safe to say. But at the time, there was a big focus on the power factor. The Xbox Series X and its 12 teraflops of compute power. This is what Microsoft ran with, and they did so because it worked for them previously with the Xbox One X, and they went all in with the 6 teraflops, making it more powerful than the PS4 Pro. This was an advantage that Microsoft had with the mid-gen refresh last generation, so they decided to double down on that with the next generation console. Can't fault them for that. Makes a lot of sense to do that. But I remember when Mark Cerny, the lead architect of the PlayStation 5, he did the Road to PS5 breakdown where he essentially spent an hour going in depth explaining every decision from a technical level that went into the PS5. But I do remember that once that concluded, the big takeaway that everybody was really focused on is the fact that the PS5 was only 10 teraflops, so about 2 teraflops less powerful than the Series X. And this created a big divide, I guess you could say, between a lot of people, where on one side, you had a lot of people telling you that, well, you're going to see big differences now in games. The Xbox Series X is going to have a distinct performance advantage. Multi-platform games are going to look and run better on the Series X. And not to say that they will be bad on the PS5, they just won't be as good, and that's what we're going to see. And, logically speaking, it kind of makes sense. You can kind of see where they're coming from. But I do remember at the time, there were people who were paying very close attention to the things that Mark Cerny had to say, kind of warning people that, listen, you can't really jump to that conclusion based on these on-paper specifications. It's a little bit more nuanced and more complicated than that. The PS5 is highly customized, and there are definitely some interesting things that Mark Cerny did that might end up, resulting in things that maybe some people wouldn't necessarily expect. Now, if we look at this Digital Foundry article here, they say, so after a few years of conversations with developers, what is the explanation? How can a less capable machine outperform the more powerful one? As seen recently in our Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree coverage, the frame rate difference in favor of the PS5 is surprising, bearing in mind it's apparently the less capable machine. We've heard some interesting theories over the years, such as how the Xbox Series X's split memory setup, 560 gigabytes of bandwidth on fast memory, 336 gigabytes on slow memory, maybe impacting performance. But the number one reason we've heard from developers concerns the nature of Sony's development environment. More than one key AAA developer tells us that the PlayStation GPU compiler is significantly more efficient than the Microsoft alternative, meaning that there's better utilization of the graphics hardware. In general, we understand that the lower level API access afforded to PlayStation development means game makers get more from the hardware. The second most common explanation we've received from developers concerns the nature of the GPU itself. Mark Cerny himself discussed this way back in March of 2020 when he revealed the technical specifications of the PS5. While the console may have fewer compute units than the Xbox Series X, 36 versus 52, the entire GPU itself runs faster, meaning that certain tasks will complete faster, better suiting certain game engine designs. The extent of this advantage was always an unknown, as the PS5 operates with a boost clock on the CPU and GPU. Maximum clock speeds will be limited by a power limit on the processor. However, we have yet to hear any complaints from developers about the boost clock unduly impacting GPU performance. And in terms of raw numbers, there's an interesting tidbit from the recently leaked PlayStation 5 Pro development documentation. Engaging the CPU boost option, which increases clock speeds by 10%, only sees GPU performance drop by about 1%, effectively negligible then. So based on our conversations, the combination of a more efficient GPU compiler, lower level APIs, and higher clock speeds allows the PlayStation 5 to match or even exceed the outputs of the Xbox Series X in some scenarios. So there we go. We have Digital Foundry saying that, look, they wanted to ultimately follow up on this now that we are multiple years into this generation, and they reached out to multiple high-profile AAA developers, simply asking them what is going on here. Why, now that we are multiple years into the generation, have we not seen the Xbox Series X start to seriously, outshine the PS5 in any meaningful way? Especially with multi-platform titles, we are still seeing the PS5 have certain advantages with, slightly higher frame rates or more stable frame rates. And it simply seems to come down to the fact that Sony, specifically Mark Cerny, seemed to have a better understanding of what developers were ultimately going to gravitate towards when it comes to game development, right? And it seems like there was this general focus on speed and efficiency more than anything, where it's like, yes, raw power is nice, having more compute power is nice, but there's also the simple question of how easy is it to tap into that power if it's difficult, or if it's not as easy as the other console, even though it may be less powerful, then ultimately it's probably not going to matter, because we are in a day and age where AAA games take many years to develop, and these developers are looking to be as efficient as they possibly can. They don't want to have to deal with, spending time and resources trying to extract every ounce of power they can, especially if they have multiple platforms that they're working on here. So I do think that this bodes very well for the upcoming PlayStation 5 Pro. I know not everybody is excited for this console, which is understandable. But honestly, if you are on the PS5 right now and you have no interest in upgrading to the PS5 Pro, I think it's safe to say you're going to continue to get games that are, in some cases, like outperforming even the more powerful Series X. I don't think you're going to see games, obviously, do better than the PS5 Pro, because the PS5 Pro is going to be substantially more powerful than the base PS5 and the Xbox Series X. But if we are seeing the PS5 be this efficient, right, and be this, I guess you could say, easy to develop for with AAA games, and a lot of developers are like, wow, this GPU compiler, it's way more efficient, right? Then I think the PS5 Pro is going to be basically a continuation of that, and we're going to see even better results because the hardware is significantly more powerful. But yeah, it's not necessarily, again, the most relevant thing at this point in time, because I think what people are mostly focused on now that we are at the halfway point of the generation is how the rest of this generation is going to play out, specifically with games. Obviously, that's what matters most at the end of the day. But I still did think it was interesting and worth kind of looking at what Digital Foundry had to present here, because they've been covering this, closer than mostly everybody, right? Like they were there at the launch of the PS5 and the Series X covering the comparisons. They've been doing so throughout all these years with all these multi-platform titles. And they finally just kind of got to this point where it's like, what is it? Because we have heard in the past that, oh, well, we need to wait for the tools or something along those lines, or developers to get more familiar with the development environment of the Xbox Series X, and then we're going to see them really take advantage of it. But, here we are 4 years later, and we're still not seeing that. And the PS5 is still seemingly showing an advantage in some cases. Why is that? It just seems like, frankly, Sony, from an engineering perspective, simply outclassed Microsoft here, where Microsoft was so focused on the power and being able to market those teraflops. Mark Cerny flat out said himself that it's dangerous to rely on the teraflop as the absolute measure of capability, essentially, for these consoles. There's more to it than that, and he was completely right. So there you go. Just wanted to have this conversation with you and go over what Digital Foundry had to say here. I think this does kind of close the case here. Even Digital Foundry said that themselves. And so next up is going to be the PS5 Pro, and I imagine things are going to get even more interesting when we start to see these comparisons of what games are doing on the PS5 Pro versus the base PS5 versus the Xbox Series X. And obviously, we'll cover that when we get there. But guys, let me know your thoughts about this down in the comments below. Leave the video a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new. Hit the bell notification icon. And feel free to share the video out on top of all that. But until next time, guys, take care.